June 6, 1944. Dawn. The first light broke over the English Channel like a blade cutting through fog. Along the cliffs of Normandy, German sentries stood wrapped in greatcoats, their breath visible in the cold morning air. Below them, the beaches stretched pale and empty: Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, Sword, names that meant nothing yet, coordinates on maps filed in concrete bunkers. The sound of waves against stone had been their companion for months, a rhythm as regular as their watch rotations. But this morning, something was different. The horizon wasn't empty anymore. It was moving. Oberstleutnant Klaus Weber squinted through the pre-dawn gloom from his position in WN 62, a fortified resistance nest overlooking what the Allies called Omaha Beach. He'd been stationed here since March, one of thousands of German soldiers manning Hitler's vaunted Atlantic Wall, that great chain of fortifications stretching from Norway to Spain. The wall was supposed to be impregnable. Rommel himself had walked these very cliffs, nodding with satisfaction at the Czech hedgehogs jutting from the sand, the Belgian gates hidden beneath the waterline, the mines buried in patterns only the engineers understood. "The enemy must be destroyed before he reaches our main battlefield," Rommel had written. Weber had read those words in a briefing. They'd seemed prophetic then. Comforting. Now, watching the dark shapes materializing through the channel mist, Weber felt something else entirely. Fear, perhaps. Or the terrible recognition that prophecy and reality were about to collide in ways no briefing could prepare him for. The German High Command had spent 4 years preparing for this moment. Since the fall of France in 1940, since the Luftwaffe's failure over Britain, since the certain knowledge that one day, someday, the Anglo-Americans would come, they had built and planned and calculated. The question was never if an invasion would come, but where and when. Calais seemed obvious, the narrowest crossing, the straightest path to Germany's industrial heart. Hitler thought so. So did most of his generals. They'd concentrated their strongest divisions there, their best equipment, their most experienced commanders. Normandy was different. Normandy was a secondary concern, defended but not prioritized. The 352nd Infantry Division had only arrived in the sector recently, a last-minute reinforcement that broke the established pattern. Most units here were static divisions, older men, recovered wounded, conscripts from occupied territories with questionable loyalty. They had fortifications, yes. They had artillery and machine guns and obstacles. What they didn't have was depth. What they didn't have was mobility. And what they didn't have, standing on those cliffs watching the greatest armada in human history emerge from the darkness, was any real conception of what American industrial might actually meant. They expected resistance. They expected to fight. What they didn't expect was for the Americans to bring their own harbors with them. The German defensive doctrine for repelling an amphibious assault was sound in theory. Destroy the enemy at the water's edge. Make the beaches a killing ground. Even if the first waves managed to claw their way ashore, even if some troops reached the bluffs, they would be isolated, cut off, without supplies or reinforcement. History showed that armies could not sustain operations across open beaches. Storms would scatter their ships. Tides would disrupt their schedules. Within days, perhaps hours, the Channel would reassert its ancient authority, and the invasion would wither on the vine. Every German officer from Weber up to Field Marshal von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, knew this fundamental truth: logistics win wars, and logistics require ports. The Allies would need harbors to sustain an invasion. Which is why every major port from Cherbourg to Le Havre was fortified, garrisoned, designated a fortress to be held to the last man. The Führer had been explicit: the ports must not fall intact. Better to see them destroyed utterly than captured functioning. This calculation shaped everything. Let the Allies come, the thinking went. Let them land their first waves. They'll batter themselves against our defenses, and even if they succeed in securing a toehold, they'll have no way to supply their armies. We'll cut them off. Contain them. Then, when the weather turns or their momentum falters, we'll drive them back into the sea. It was rational. It was logical. It was based on centuries of military wisdom about the tyranny of supply lines and the limitations of amphibious warfare. It was also completely wrong. Because at 6:30 in the morning on June 6, 1944, as the first American soldiers hit Omaha Beach and the first shells began screaming overhead, something was already beginning that would shatter every German assumption about what was possible in modern warfare. Something was coming that couldn't be destroyed by coastal artillery or driven back by machine gun fire. Something too large to bomb, too distributed to target, too revolutionary to fit into any existing tactical framework. The Americans were bringing their harbors with them. They were called mulberries. The concept was so audacious it bordered on madness. When British Prime Minister Winston Churchill first proposed it in 1942, scribbling the words, "Piers for use on beaches," in a memo to his combined operations staff, even his own planners thought it fantastical. Build artificial harbors? Tow them across the channel? Anchor them off hostile shores and operate them under fire? The engineering challenges alone seemed insurmountable. The logistics boggled the mind. The cost in resources and labor would be staggering, but the strategic necessity was undeniable. The Allies could take beaches. The invasions of North Africa, Sicily, and Italy had proved that. But holding beaches and building up forces fast enough to prevent a German counterattack was a different matter entirely. A study of Normandy's tide tables and weather patterns made grim reading. Even in summer, storms could blow in from the Atlantic with little warning. A traditional supply operation, with ships anchoring offshore and ferrying supplies to beaches in small craft, would be hideously vulnerable. Days, perhaps weeks, could be lost waiting for weather windows. The Germans needed only to delay Allied build-up long enough to mass their panzer divisions for a decisive counterstroke. Time was the weapon they'd use to defeat the invasion. Unless the Allies could somehow create the infrastructure of a major port where none existed. Unless they could guarantee that supplies would flow regardless of weather, regardless of German resistance, regardless of every historical precedent that said it couldn't be done. The Mulberry Harbors were Britain and America's answer, not an answer born of confidence, but of necessity. 2 harbors, each roughly the size of Dover, would be constructed in sections in England, then towed across the Channel and assembled off the Normandy coast. Mulberry A would serve the American beaches. Mulberry B would support the British and Canadian sectors. Together, they would handle the tonnage of major ports, thousands of tons of supplies per day, hundreds of vehicles, the vast river of ammunition and food and fuel that modern mechanized armies consumed at rates that would have astounded Napoleon or Lee. The design was both ingenious and monstrous. The outer breakwaters would be formed by bombardones, floating steel cruciform structures anchored to the seabed, designed to dampen wave action. Inside these would be the Phoenix caissons, massive concrete structures, some as large as 5-story buildings, that would be sunk in precise positions to form breakwaters and piers. Then came the Whale, floating roadways, flexible steel bridges that would rise and fall with the tide, connecting the caissons to the shore. Finally, Gooseberry, breakwaters made from deliberately scuttled ships, obsolete vessels filled with concrete and positioned to create sheltered anchorages. It required 400 towing craft. It required 10,000 workers laboring in British ports and fabrication yards. It required 600,000 tons of concrete and steel. It required a level of industrial coordination and engineering ambition that, even in a war already defined by unprecedented scales of production, stood out as extraordinary. And it required secrecy. Total, absolute secrecy. Because if the Germans learned what was coming, if they understood that the Allies intended to create artificial harbors, they might adjust their entire defensive strategy. They might position forces differently. They might develop countermeasures. The element of surprise, already difficult enough to achieve in the most telegraphed invasion in history, would be lost entirely. So the Mulberry components were built in scattered locations and referred to only by code names. Officers briefed on the project were restricted from travel. The sections assembled in the Thames estuary and along the southern coast were camouflaged, described in documents as pontoons, or pier sections, without elaboration. When workers asked what they were building, they were told simply that it was for the invasion and nothing more. The compartmentalization was so effective that many of the engineers and laborers didn't understand the full scope of what they'd created until they saw the photographs weeks later. On the German side, there was almost no intelligence about the Mulberry Harbors. A few aerial reconnaissance photos showed unusual construction activity in British ports, but these were interpreted as preparations for conventional landing craft and supply vessels. The German naval staff did consider the theoretical possibility of artificial harbors. It wasn't an entirely new concept, but dismissed it as impractical. The engineering challenges were too great. And positioning craft and the hundreds of specialized vessels needed to assemble an artificial harbor under fire. The battle for the beaches dominated June 6. Omaha Beach became a nightmare of blood and heroism, the American 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions clawing their way up bluffs against murderous German fire. The 352nd Infantry Division, positioned there by chance, extracted a terrible toll. For hours, the outcome hung in doubt. Junior officers and NCOs, often acting independently after their commanders were killed, led small groups up the draws and ravines. By noon, by sheer determination and individual valor, they'd created the narrowest of toeholds. By evening, they'd pushed inland, still taking casualties, still fighting for every hedgerow and village. But while that battle raged, another operation was beginning. At Utah Beach, where American casualties were lighter and the advance more rapid, engineers began surveying sites for harbor construction. Underwater demolition teams cleared approach channels. Survey ships plotted depths and currents. The logistics staff began the intricate choreography of moving Mulberry components into position. The first Phoenix caissons arrived on June 7. Each was an engineering marvel and a logistical nightmare, reinforced concrete structures weighing up to 6,000 tons, with ballast tanks that could be flooded to sink them in precise positions. Getting them across the channel in the wake of a still contested invasion was an achievement in itself. Towing concrete buildings through submarine-infested waters while German aircraft still contested the skies required coordination between the Royal Navy, the U.S. Navy, and the Merchant Marine that was unprecedented in complexity. Oberstfighter Weber, if he survived the initial assault, and many of his comrades in WN-62 did not, would have watched this process unfold with growing incomprehension. The first day could be understood, a massive attack, overwhelming force, brutal but within the framework of military experience. The second day, with reinforcements pouring ashore and the beachhead expanding, was alarming but still comprehensible. But the third day, the fourth day, the fifth, watching concrete structures being maneuvered into position offshore, watching the beginning of what was clearly harbor construction, watching the methodical transformation of empty beach into organized port facility even as combat raged just a few miles inland, this was something else. This was the revelation of an enemy operating under different rules, with different constraints, animated by a different understanding of what war could be. By June 18, 12 days after the invasion, significant portions of both Mulberry Harbors were operational. Ships could unload at the piers. Vehicles could drive directly from transport holds onto floating roadways and then to shore. Supplies began flowing at rates that exceeded even optimistic pre-invasion projections. The American Mulberry A was handling 7,000 tons per day. The British Mulberry B was doing even better. Then, on June 19, the channel reminded everyone that nature was still a force to be reckoned with. A storm, the worst June storm in 40 years, blew in from the Atlantic. For 3 days, winds reached near gale force. Waves crashed over breakwaters. Ships broke from their moorings. The American Mulberry A, positioned in slightly more exposed waters, was effectively destroyed. Caissons shifted. Whale segments broke apart. Bombardones tore loose from their anchors. It was a disaster that would have vindicated every German assumption about the impossibility of sustained supply across open beaches. The weather had intervened, just as doctrine predicted. The artificial harbor had failed. Surely now the invasion would stall. But it didn't. The British Mulberry B, though damaged, remained largely functional. More importantly, the Americans simply adapted. They'd already landed enough supplies and equipment to resource demands too heavy. The British and Americans were capable of impressive feats, yes, but this would require them to essentially reinvent port infrastructure in a matter of weeks, under combat conditions, in hostile waters. It was simply beyond credibility. So it was ignored. This failure of imagination would prove catastrophic. But it was an understandable failure, rooted in reasonable assumptions about what was possible in warfare. The Germans had fought the British for 5 years. They'd faced American forces in North Africa and Italy. They'd captured enormous quantities of equipment, studied Allied doctrine, interrogated thousands of prisoners. They knew the Anglo-Americans had advantages in production, yes. More tanks. More planes. More supplies. But the Mulberry Harbors represented something beyond mere quantitative advantage. They represented a qualitative transformation in the nature of logistics itself, a willingness to apply industrial-age engineering solutions to problems that had constrained military operations since ancient times. They represented wealth so abundant that it could be spent not just on weapons, but on infrastructure that would be used once and then possibly discarded. They represented a logistical mindset that didn't accept natural limitations but engineered around them. Standing on the Normandy cliffs that morning, watching the Armada approach, the German defenders couldn't see the Mulberry components yet. Those were still far out at sea, camouflaged among the thousands of vessels crowding the channel. What they saw was the surface fleet, battleships, cruisers, destroyers providing fire support, transport ships disgorging landing craft, the organized chaos of history's largest amphibious assault. What they didn't see, what they couldn't see, was the second wave behind it. The tow ships pulling Phoenix caissons. The vessels carrying whale segments. The old freighters designated for scuttling as gooseberry breakwaters. The salvage tugs. Beach operations and the captured ports. By August, when the Allied breakout from Normandy became a general advance across France, the logistics infrastructure supporting it was moving 20,000 tons per day through Normandy beaches and ports. To understand what this meant, consider a single German infantry division in 1944. It required roughly 100 tons of supplies per day to sustain combat operations, ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, spare parts. A panzer division needed 3 to 4 times that, given the fuel consumption of tanks and vehicles. The German army in Normandy, at its peak strength before the Allied invasion, numbered roughly 50 divisions of various types. Even assuming perfect efficiency and no losses, supplying them required approximately 15,000 tons per day. The Allies, by August 1944, were moving more tonnage through their Normandy infrastructure alone than would have been needed to supply the entire German force defending France. They were doing it across beaches that had been hostile territory 2 months before. They were doing it with artificial harbors that conventional military wisdom said were impossible. They were doing it while simultaneously supporting an advance, replacing losses, building up reserves, and maintaining air superiority. This was the material reality that shattered German morale as much as any battlefield defeat. Individual German soldiers were brave. German equipment, particularly late-war tanks and weapons, was often superior in quality to Allied equivalents. German tactical doctrine remained sophisticated. But none of it mattered against an enemy that could simply overwhelm any defense through sheer abundance of resources. The Mulberry Harbors became symbols of this abundance. German prisoners, interrogated by Allied intelligence, often mentioned them with a kind of awed despair. "You brought your own harbors," one captured major reportedly said. "How do we fight that? We can destroy your resource demands too heavy." The British and Americans were capable of impressive feats, yes, but this would require them to essentially reinvent port infrastructure in a matter of weeks, under combat conditions, in hostile waters. It was simply beyond credibility. So it was ignored. This failure of imagination would prove catastrophic. But it was an understandable failure, rooted in reasonable assumptions about what was possible in warfare. The Germans had fought the British for 5 years. They'd faced American forces in North Africa and Italy. They'd captured enormous quantities of equipment, studied Allied doctrine, interrogated thousands of prisoners. They knew the Anglo-Americans had advantages in production, yes. More tanks. More planes. More supplies. But the Mulberry Harbors represented something beyond mere quantitative advantage. They represented a qualitative transformation in the nature of logistics itself, a willingness to apply industrial-age engineering solutions to problems that had constrained military operations since ancient times. They represented wealth so abundant that it could be spent not just on weapons, but on infrastructure that would be used once and then possibly discarded. They represented a logistical mindset that didn't accept natural limitations but engineered around them. Standing on the Normandy cliffs that morning, watching the Armada approach, the German defenders couldn't see the Mulberry components yet. Those were still far out at sea, camouflaged among the thousands of vessels crowding the channel. What they saw was the surface fleet, battleships, cruisers, destroyers providing fire support, transport ships disgorging landing craft, the organized chaos of history's largest amphibious assault. What they didn't see, what they couldn't see, was the second wave behind it. The tow ships pulling Phoenix caissons. The vessels carrying whale segments. The old freighters designated for scuttling as gooseberry breakwaters. The salvage tugs. Ships, but you build new ones. We can blow up your trucks, but you have more. We can hold a port, and you just make your own. What army in history has ever had such resources? It was a fair question. The answer really was no army in history. The American industrial base in 1944 was producing war material at rates that dwarfed any previous economy. A single Liberty ship, the mass-produced cargo vessel that formed the backbone of Allied logistics, could be built in less than 5 days by experienced shipyards. The United States was producing one new ship every day, plus hundreds of landing craft, plus thousands of vehicles, plus millions of tons of ammunition and supplies. But raw production wasn't the whole story. Plenty of nations have had large economies and strong industries. What made the American approach unique, what the Mulberry Harbors exemplified, was the willingness to apply that industrial capacity not just to weapons, but to solving fundamental logistical and engineering problems. The Manhattan Project, developing the atomic bomb, was perhaps the most famous example. But the Mulberry Harbors, in their own way, were equally representative of a distinctly American approach to warfare: define the problem, engineer a solution, and build it regardless of cost or conventional limitations. This approach was alien to the German military tradition, which emphasized tactical excellence, operational brilliance, and making do with limited resources. German soldiers were trained to be resourceful, to improvise, to achieve victory through superior skill and fighting spirit. These were genuine virtues, and they'd served Germany well in the early years of the war. Blitzkrieg doctrine, hitting hard, moving fast, disrupting enemy logistics before they could respond, was built on the assumption that tactical superiority could overcome material inferiority. But by 1944, the Wehrmacht was facing an enemy that couldn't be disrupted because their logistics were simply too robust, too redundant, too overwhelming. You could destroy a Mulberry Harbor, as the June storm effectively did, and they'd just build another one or work around it. You could force them to fight for every port, as the Germans did with Cherbourg, Brest, and Le Havre, and they'd either repair the damage faster than seemed possible, or just supply their armies directly across beaches. There was no tactical solution to this. No amount of fighting spirit or operational brilliance could overcome the fundamental reality that the Allies, particularly the Americans, had industrialized warfare to a degree that made traditional military virtues secondary to production capacity and logistical efficiency. The psychological impact of this realization rippled through the German ranks in Normandy. It manifested in small ways and large. Soldiers who'd been told they were defending Fortress Europe, manning the invincible Atlantic Wall, found themselves retreating inland within days. Officers who'd expected the invasion to falter for lack of supplies watched Allied stockpiles grow daily. Veterans who'd survived the Eastern Front and thought they'd seen the worst that modern war could offer encountered an enemy that fought differently, not with the desperate ferocity of the Soviets, but with a methodical, almost industrial approach to combat. American infantry tactics emphasized fire support over maneuver. When encountering resistance, American units would often pull back and call in artillery, aircraft, or tanks rather than press forward. This seemed unimaginative to German officers trained in aggressive tactics. But it was effective, and it was sustainable, because the Americans always had more ammunition than they could possibly expend. One German soldier, in a letter intercepted by Allied censors, wrote, "They don't fight like soldiers. They fight like a factory, producing death and destruction on an assembly line. For every one of us, there are 10 of them. For every shell we fire, they fire 20. They don't need to be brave or clever. They just need to keep coming, and they do, endlessly, like the tide." The tide? It was an appropriate metaphor. Because in a sense, that's what the Mulberry Harbors represented, the ability to channel the tide of American industrial production directly onto hostile shores, without pause, without the vulnerabilities that nature and geography had always imposed on military operations. For all of human history, armies had been constrained by supply lines. Alexander worried about logistics in Persia. Napoleon's catastrophe in Russia was fundamentally a failure of supply. Lee's invasions of the North were limited by his inability to sustain his army far from base. Entire campaigns had turned on the capture or defense of ports, bridges, railheads, the choke points through which supplies had to flow. The Mulberry Harbors didn't eliminate logistics as a concern, nothing could do that. But they dramatically reduced the vulnerabilities that geography imposed. They made the invasion sustainable even when conventional ports were denied. They gave the Allies time to consolidate their beachhead, build up forces, and prepare for the breakout. The British Mulberry Bee remained in operation until November 1944, 6 months after D-Day. In that time, it handled over 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies. The American beaches, even without their Mulberry, handled comparable amounts. Together, the Normandy infrastructure landed and supplied the armies that would liberate France, reach the German border, and ultimately win the war in Europe. The Germans had expected the logistics to be the Allies' weakness. They'd planned for it. They'd fortified the ports. They'd positioned their defenses to contain any beachhead until supply problems forced a withdrawal. Every calculation, every plan, every defensive doctrine had assumed that the Channel itself would be their strongest ally, that weather and tide and the simple impossibility of sustained supply across open beaches would defeat the invasion even if their soldiers couldn't. Instead, the Americans and British brought their harbors with them. They turned impossibility into infrastructure in a matter of days. They met every obstacle, German resistance, natural barriers, even destructive storms, and overcame them not through tactical brilliance alone, but through an engineering and industrial capacity that redefined what was possible in warfare. For the German soldiers who'd manned the Atlantic Wall, who'd believed in the propaganda about impregnable fortifications and inevitable Allied defeat, the Mulberry Harbors were more than just a tactical surprise. They were a revelation of the enemy's true nature. This wasn't an army that would be stopped by conventional means. This wasn't an enemy that would exhaust itself against fixed defenses. This was something new, industrial warfare perfected, resources applied without apparent limit, engineering solutions to problems that previous generations had simply accepted as immutable facts of military life. In the ruins of WN 62, if Oberstfighter Weber had survived to see it, the view would have told the story. The concrete bunker he manned was now pockmarked with shell impacts, its guns silenced, its fields of fire now traveled by Allied vehicles driving up the beach draws without opposition. Below, on the sand that had been a killing ground on June 6, there were trucks and supply dumps and medical stations. Offshore, floating on the water that was supposed to be the Germans' ultimate defense, were the piers and breakwaters of an artificial harbor, impossible things, made real, symbols of an abundance and ingenuity that his side simply couldn't match. How do you fight an enemy that can build harbors on demand? How do you defend against a force that treats geography itself as just another engineering problem to be solved? The answer, increasingly clear to German soldiers through the summer of 1944, was that you couldn't. Not with the resources available. Not against this opponent. The Mulberry Harbors weren't the only factor in the Allied victory in Normandy, of course. Brave soldiers fought and died on both sides. Tactical decisions mattered. Leadership mattered. The role of air superiority, of intelligence, of French resistance, all these contributed to the outcome. Wars are won by the complex interaction of countless factors, and no single element determines everything. But among all those factors, the Mulberry Harbors stand out for what they represented about the nature of the conflict. They were proof that the Allies, particularly the Americans, were fighting a different kind of war than the Germans had prepared for, a war where problems that had constrained military operations throughout history could simply be engineered away if you were willing to spend the resources. A war where abundance was itself a weapon, perhaps the decisive weapon. This was the hard lesson that the Wehrmacht learned in Normandy. They prepared for an enemy they understood. They got an enemy who brought their own harbors to the invasion, who could afford to lose one to a storm and barely pause, who treated supply challenges that would cripple any other army as minor inconveniences to be overcome with more steel and more concrete and more engineering genius. It was abundance as ideology made manifest. The American way of war, built on the foundation of the world's most productive economy, demonstrated in the most emphatic way possible that material superiority could overwhelm tactical skill, that industrial capacity could reshape strategic reality, that logistics, mundane, unglamorous logistics, could decide the fate of nations. The Phoenix caissons are mostly gone now, claimed by the sea or demolished for scrap. A few remain visible at low tide near Arromanches, where the British Mulberry Bee operated, now weathered monuments to an engineering feat that most people have forgotten. But in the summer of 1944, they were the difference between hope and defeat, between a tenuous beachhead and a sustainable invasion, between what military doctrine said was possible and what American industry made real. The German soldiers who watched them appear, who saw the impossible harbors taking shape even as they retreated inland, understood something that the people back home would take longer to accept: this war was already lost. Not because German soldiers wouldn't fight bravely. Not because German generals lacked skill. But because the other side had resources and industrial might on a scale that made traditional military virtues secondary to production capacity. Because when your enemy can tow harbors across the sea and drop them on hostile shores and make them operational in days, you're not just fighting an army. You're fighting the full might of an industrial economy that has turned all its energies toward your destruction, that treats engineering challenges as problems to be solved rather than limitations to be accepted, that has so much material abundance it can afford to build entire ports just to use them once. That was the truth the Mulberry Harbors revealed. That was the symbolic meaning that transcended their tactical function. They were democracy's answer to dictatorship, abundance's answer to fanaticism, engineering's answer to ideology. They were floating proof that the free world's factories and shipyards and design bureaus, when fully mobilized, could create marvels that no amount of military tradition or fighting spirit could counter, and in the end, that made all the difference. The beaches were won by soldiers. But the campaign was won by harbors, strange, impossible harbors that appeared by morning, that turned the tide of war in ways that gunfire alone never could, that showed what happens when a nation's industrial might is fully unleashed in service of a cause it believes is just. The tide came in. The harbors came with it. And nothing was ever the same.